And the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Hello and welcome to the only independent news and opinion program where we chronicle two distinct possibilities, either the demise and possible extinction of the Homo sapien or the greatest leap forward in human history. One thing is certain, there is no status quo. This is the Daily Australian Radio Show, episode number 64 for Thursday, April the 3rd, 2025. My name is Jason Olborn. I have got the gloves on and I take them off in a moment, as will my partner in news, her name Nicola Charles. Welcome back. Happy Thursday.
Jason, why do you always sound so bouncy and I feel like poop?
Maybe it's because I had an extra dose of zinc yesterday, and that's what's permeating through the voices. It also could be that you fake it till you make it. You see, this is the other component. But just letting everyone know that the recording takes place generally around 6 o'clock in the morning, and today we expect the Trump tariff announcement to come out at 7 a.m. So we might not be able to cover that for you in as much depth as we would right now in this show, but we will certainly be covering off that tomorrow. But that is just one of many, many stories that we do cover on this radio show.
Well, it was really creepy yesterday at work. I could see the television from my desk, and I think Albo and Dutton were in Melbourne, and I could see them in Melbourne places. And it's quite funny, as I've said before, watching Anthony Albanese speak with the sound off, muted. It's horrible. It's really, really horrible. By the way, that post has gone viral of him copying the speech from Michael Douglas and the American president. The comments under that post, if you haven't read them, are absolutely hilarious. But I'm cheered up a bit this morning because there's huge news, Jason. I think there's a certain amount of things and a certain amount of people that the public want held to account. This is part of it, because is it true that Anthony Fauci's wife has been fired?
Yes, that's correct. She's been let go by the NIH. We found that out this morning. So Benny Johnson was the original person that has posted this probably about less than 2 hours ago now. And the headline reads, "Mass layoffs hit health agencies that track disease and regulate food. The cuts were part of a Trump administration plan announced last week to dismiss thousands of employees and drastically overhaul the Health and Human Services Department under Secretary RFK Jr. And at the NIH, several institute directors, including Dr. Jeannie Marazzo, head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the institute formerly led by Fauci himself, were reassigned. So were Fauci's wife, Christine Grady, the head of NIH Office of Bioethics, and Dr. Clifford Lane, a close ally of Dr. Fauci, who oversaw clinical research. So they're saying officially they've been reassigned, but no longer holding those positions of power, such as at the head, if you can believe this. Christine Grady, Fauci's wife, held the position of the head of the NIH Office of Bioethics. Could you have anything more obscene in that particular situation?
Well, that's a conflict of interest. If she's the head of bioethics and he's breaking all bioethics codes, but he's allowed to because he's her husband, we've got a real problem, haven't we? And obviously we have had a real problem, and it's caused a lot of harm. I mean, that's extraordinary. How was that even allowed to happen in a civilized society?
Well, this is correct. And see, the other interesting part of it, now, here's the thing that people might not think about. And then when I say it, they'll go, wow, there's a law. Well, the law prevents a spouse testifying against a spouse. So what a perfect situation to have, that you have husband doing horrific things and the bioethics person in charge is the wife, and she can't testify against him no matter what.
You're like a protected species then. It's crazy.
Correct. It's unbelievable, isn't it, that you would think that that's the case? But that just shows you the level of detail that these people will go to cover their own tracks.
It just kind of it does show, for those who have any doubts, it does show that there's a lot of strategy going on here to remove what is likely someone who is integral in the wrongdoing, but without jumping around about it because, Trump's not at the podium going, I fired Fauci's wife for you. I mean,
Mm.
we'd love to see that. I fired Fauci. I've taken away his pension. I know he's retired now. I've fired his wife. But it's like strategic in the background, taking out the wrongdoers, taking out their funding, doing anything he can. It is a little bit like he's gone to war with the deep state and he's just doing it systematically, taking down their wall brick by brick. And that's a good thing, right?
It is the best thing that we can possibly hope for at this stage. But what's interesting is that, as you said, so if you were to just go out and punt everyone, like what's happening through DOGE, in these circumstances, you get these activist judges, attempting to reinstate them at every level. So there is an art to be able to do this.
There's an art in firing people. Look, he was the apprentice guy, right? So if there's an art to saying you're fired, he's got the art.
Well, exactly. Well, he certainly knows what he's doing, doesn't he? And even then, he's being challenged at every level. It's the reason why I keep saying that there has to be another way through this legally. Whether these people will commit treason at that level, which then brings in the military at that point, so that these things head towards some sort of military tribunal, is an interesting perspective. But many people think that there's a few steps in the place there for what's going on. So, look, you can either be positive or you can be negative, and most of the news is negative and most of the bad news is what sells. But at the same time, when you really look at what's going on here, we are no doubt, as Michael Yon said in the interview I did with him for the 51st state, we are in an information war, and information war technically is World War III. In that interview, he declared that, I asked him straight out, I said, who is the real enemy? And he said it's the United Nations. And I think that's it is a headline in itself for somebody of Michael Yon's stature, who's been interviewed by Tucker Carlson, been interviewed by everyone in the main. He's out there in Panama at the moment. He's reporting on what's happening there. Now, interestingly, we haven't covered it in much detail, but this idea that China was going to sell the Panama Canal and it was going to be purchased by BlackRock, which was meant to be a good thing. Well, China's rejected that. They won't sell the Panama Canal to BlackRock. So that's interesting in itself. And of course, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But we all know that.
Oh God, don't tell me I'm emotionally siding with China because they're trying to block BlackRock. That's crazy.
This again says this is this sort of edging around in what's going on. So there can only be two sides to every issue. I mean, you can say that there are three, but generally what happens is there's either a positive, a negative, an up and down, a left or right. That 51% to 49%. This is what's going on. So that can only be a good thing. I agree with you that there is some.
Well, they can't own everything, Jason. That's a proper dictatorship, and I don't want to be dictated to by a bloody hedge fund.
I agree with you. And it's interesting, the other day we never quite got to it, but I mentioned Bob Ellis, the person that I met who used to be a high up in the Labor Party speechwriter, written for speeches for anyone from Gough Whitlam, Kevin Rudd, Kim Beazley, Bob Hawke. He'd written to everyone, and I happened to be invited to have a lunch with him informally at a state conference for the Labor Party way back in 2007. And in it, he said to me straight out, we're sitting there waiting for a steak sandwich to be delivered. And he said to me, what is the end result of competition? And I looked at him like a dumb 35-year-old as I was at the time. And I kind of, just choked on my tongue. And he said, one winner. He said, that's the problem with business today, is that all competition will inevitably end up in a monopoly. And I said to him, so how do you fix it? And he says, it's simple. We limit all corporations to having only 4 outlets.
I thought we did. I thought we had monopolies commissions. It's too early. I thought we had the ACCC. I believe Rennick and Malcolm Roberts have approached the ACCC to say, why does BlackRock own so much in Australia? I didn't think it was possible or allowed for a hedge fund, anyone, to have controlling interest in Coles, Woolworths. I don't think they've got controlling interest, but they've got shares in IGA, Bunnings, Officeworks. it's too much. They're probably involved in the land titles office. There's something going on. It's this creeping control. And people have stood up in the Senate and said, what's going on with BlackRock, but we still don't have any answers.
Correct. And the thing is, you don't necessarily have to have a 51% controlling interest. You can just have enough of a percentage of ownership to earn a seat on the board.
Yeah.
And so therefore that influences control. It's like Bill Gates putting his fingers in every pie.
Well,
It's
you
the
know
same
why?
thing.
It's so they can say, let's sell lab grown meat. Let's sell meat that has bovere in it. That's why, because when they're controlling the food supply, which is really scary that they even want to. I wouldn't want to control the food supply. I would want to just give people a choice and they can decide on their own health. Why does this hedge fund want to control the food supply? It's odd.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very good question, isn't it? And it's obvious when those of us are sitting here with our radar detectors, on full alert, that we're thinking about this and going, well, isn't it obvious? But for the average person, no, because you would think that if you were to control the food supply and something went wrong and you were to be held to account, therefore, if that were the case, you've got a huge risk that you need to mitigate. But it seems the opposite holds, that these people want as much possible control, knowing that they'll never be held to account. So accountability is where we are lacking. And isn't it interesting that every politician that gets elected today, the vast majority have legal backgrounds? They're lawyers. And
No,
so
well, you need to be. Someone said something interesting to me on X a couple of days ago, and I should have mentioned it. They were talking about these injections, the mRNA, and they said, isn't it interesting how when we had the strawberry scandal and apparently people were putting pins or needles into strawberries and, people were getting warned. I found that very odd. I mean, who would do that in the first place? And there was outrage and strawberries were pulled and it was huge in the press. And yet all these adverse reactions, we get nothing, but we had a big hoo-ha about strawberries. It's all very odd.
well, everything is odd today. You're just thinking, well, how did we arrive at this particular point? And so for mine, it's the term the slippery slope. And so when you see something in a certain direction, you know that the powers that be that put it there in the first instance are going to rely on that again to advance that cause. So therefore, what happens is you become alert to what is known as agenda politics. Everything is an agenda. Everything is planned out. Everything is predicted and played, and these various different think tanks lead to a certain decision, and these different globalist quasi-government boards, and wherever the money is, and it's kind of obvious, isn't it? So unless there is a rearguard action or a form of resistance, you are going along in a certain direction. And it's no wonder why these people are ganging up against the Trump administration that seems to be the enemy of all of what we don't like. Trump is the enemy of them. And so therefore you have to say, well, how do I fight this? Now, I can then go to the Trump side and say, well, then I've got to steer that in a certain direction, which is what most people are doing. But to then attack the Trump side kind of means that's where the term controlled opposition comes out of it. Because people will then say, but hang on, Trump is controlled opposition. Well, Trump is the only opposition to what you don't like. There is no one else.
Well, at least you've got someone trying to stand up to them. I got contacted by an ex-Victorian police officer just after they put me on the ABC News and said I was Australia's biggest conspiracy theorist. And the former police officer said to me, and I've always had a good relationship with the police. He said to me, you need to keep going. You need to keep doing what you're doing. He said, because you're not a conspiracy theorist. What you are actually is a citizen officer. And he said, the reason is, the way police investigations work is that someone reports a suspicion of crime. And he said, basically, you've got people sending you stuff and you're noticing stuff yourself. And it feels like and looks like, there's a suspicion of crime. And of course, the biggest crime is conspiracy, and they're all guilty of it. Obviously, they've hidden stuff from us for years. And he said, what happens then as a police officer is you take that suspicion of a crime and you investigate it. in any way you can to try and get evidence. And he said, that's all you people are doing out there, is you're investigating what is now a suspicion of crime. So he said, you're not breaking any laws. You're not being a conspiracy theorist. You're trying to get to the bottom of it, which I found really comforting. And here we are 5 years later, and we're still trying. And now we're noticing these people getting knocked off their perches, Anthony Fauci's wife, or these departments losing their funding, and then the obviously corrupt courts scrambling to get this funding back for them. Oh, you can't just, you can't just drop them like a hot potato and they've got no funding. Why not? Why not? They're corrupt. The money's not going where they're saying it's going. They're pushing ideologies that aren't in the best interest of Americans in that case, and I'm sure it's the same here in Australia. So why shouldn't we investigate whether it's right or wrong what they're doing? We've been indoctrinated over the last 5 years to just take it, and we're sick of it, and we're not going to take it. They're trying to edge us into this world and hope we won't notice, but we have noticed, Jason.
Oh, we've more than noticed. And what we're trying to do is trying to decipher where our threats are and rank them in some form of order and work out which ones we can take action on and which ones we can avoid and which ones we can create workarounds. And then we're trying to organize ourselves into a system to be able to dismantle it politically. And if all that fails, what are we going to do? Are we going to pack up and move to another country? Are we going to put our hands in the air and surrender? Are we going to maybe want to fly off to the moon or Mars? And I'll tell you what, if it came to it and the technology was there, I'd be the first one that'd say I'll go and live on Mars.
You're nuts.
You guys could keep your planet.
You're nuts, mate.
Well, the thing is, it's all about innovation, and at the end of the day, my argument is simple. That we are living in a universe where look, some people believe that we can't get off the planet. I'm saying if it was proven that you could, I just think it's ridiculous to think that the whole argument is that there are too many people on Earth. That at the end of the day.
Well, there isn't too many people on Earth, but I worry if you got shot out into space, it would be very much like these billionaires who go on these submarines with their children and some friends. And, despite us having all this technology and things are controlled by satellites out in space, these things sink and these people die. And it feels strategic. It feels like a trap. And talking of billionaires, I had a really worrying conversation last night with a very rich friend, yes, a billionaire of mine in Australia, who sold up all his businesses and moved overseas. And he said, Australia's ruined and there's nothing anyone can do about it, but keep going because you're a real go-getter. And I thought, oh my God, like if our wealthy are fleeing, are leaving, this person was a mass employer, and he did sell the business on, and apparently the new owners are keeping the staff. But this is very worrying, Jason, that the money is leaving Australia. Very worrying indeed. And one of the places they feel happy to go, of course, is America. They're huge fans of Trump.
Well, this makes a lot of sense because this is what we talk about, Fortress America. The globalists are saying, well, we realise that Trump is the resistance, so we're going to go on regardless. They're hopefully thinking that Trump will eventually leave and they can get their power back and take over that way. But the plan is, and has always been, the takeover of the United States to institute the one world government, totalitarian control. So going back to Michael Yon's interview, and please check it out on the X. I've put it on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, even Substack, under Jason Q Citizen on Substack. He said that, I asked him, the last question was, what are the 5 threats that you see if you can rank them? He said invasion is number 1. So he's talking specifically about illegal immigration. He said the number 2 threat was technology. He said the number 3 threat is depopulation. The number 4 threat is famine. And the number 5 threat, which it was informal, was sabotage. So that we're aware of that. It's interesting that was the case. So this is my whole point, that climate change is all about depopulation. It's convincing us that there are too many of us that have altered the earth to a point that we can no longer survive. That's what that is meant to mean. Technology obviously is being used in any way to corral us, if for want of a better term. In other words, to
control. It's a control management system.
Correct, or one might say an open air prison. Invasion is to change the fabric of society where you know or where you live. That's obvious, and we're seeing that the worst in cases of the United Kingdom, throughout Europe. He also talked specifically, Michael, about Luxembourg. He said in a short period of time, he said 50% of the population was illegal immigrants. He said that he had numbers that high. He said
Oh, it's
you
such
wouldn't
a little
recognize.
country.
That's
What a
right.
shame.
He said you wouldn't recognize it in the streets. You've literally got people defecating in the streets in Luxembourg.
Same
He
in
said,
England. You've got guys, there are videos from the UK of people looking from their bedroom windows, and there are migrants, having sex with cars, if you can believe such a thing. And yes, I'm talking about the exhaust pipe, and a guy filmed it and he's going, "Oh my God, where's the police?" And he shouted from the window, "Mate, what do you think you're doing?" And the guy just carried on. And also defecating on street corners. I mean, when they talk about equity and fairness and all this, it's not for them. No one's defecating in Klaus Schwab's backyard or Bill Gates's backyard. No, this is, as I said yesterday, this isn't about leveling them up to our standard of living. It's about turning our countries, the Western world, into the third world. Right. And I do think it's about resources. I think the very wealthy are very greedy. Obviously, we know that. They're prepared to do anything. They're prepared to send people to work for 12 to 14 hours a day, underpay them, know these people are breaking their bodies, never seeing their children. They don't care as long as they roll up in their Bentley. And it also goes to what you were saying with that list about famine, right? And this explains why BlackRock, the hedge fund who's involved in all this New World Order, why they want to control the food supply and the supermarkets. But yeah, they want us to be the third world. Now they know, and they knew, that we wouldn't just organically become the third world, no matter how much they broke us. If there'd been no migration into Australia, right? Even if they broke us to the point financially where, let's say, half of Australians lost their homes and ended up renting or living in caravans or cars or whatever, we wouldn't become the third world because we've been indoctrinated and raised to be civilized. I'm afraid that's just true. Christian, conservative, constitutional Western countries have been civilized. And once you've been civilized, it's hard to uncivilize you. So what they're doing is they are bringing in as many uncivilized cultures as they possibly can. They're not all uncivilized. There are plenty of cultures coming in who are as civilized as we are. But they also, not so much in Australia, I don't think. Well, there's some, but in the UK, very much so, to the point where people are shocked and they're filming it and they're thinking, what is going on? I mean, there are videos out of the UK of migrants who are hanging on to the back of double-decker buses in London, red buses, hanging off the back, waving a machete around as it's going down Oxford Street. And no one's doing anything about it. No, I really believe this is a stand down order as well. It's a stand down order. And when Jacinta Allen, the unelected by no one Premier of Victoria, came out a couple of weeks ago and said, "Oh, I'm strengthening bail laws and this, that, and the other." Think about what she's saying. She's strengthening bail laws, so she's going to charge more money for bail, right? People are going to find the money because these migrants, they steal stuff for money anyway. I'm sorry, it's just true. I've got friends who work in council who are prepared to testify in court how when they go into some of these migrants' homes to check on the children and check on the living situation, there's a giant bowl on the kitchen counter and there's about 300 iPhones in it that they've stolen. They just pile them up. No one's checking in on these migrants. No one's watching them. So these bail laws, they get them to pay more money, which is just more money to the government because they know they're not going to adhere to the bail, right? So that means that's more money for the government. But think about what she's saying. Why are they being bailed in the first place? A lot of this is violent crime. the migrant teenagers attack the Australian OG teenagers, usually to steal their phone, but they kick them and slap them. And we've also got these videos coming out of the UK. And it's violent crime, what I would categorize as violent crime. And I think, it's almost Magna Carta stuff. It's the Ten Commandments. You don't hurt other people. This is all part of our civilized society. You don't do it. And it used to be that if we saw it, you call the cops and those people get locked up. But what the unelected Premier of Victoria is saying, oh, I'll strengthen the bail laws, is that she's still going to bail them when they should be on remand. Right, you should be on remand for violent crime because it's not safe for you to be on bail. But all she's talking about is money, because all these people care about is money, Jason.
Mm-hmm. It's always distilled down to that, isn't it? So money equals power equals control. And if you have it, then you can play. And if you don't, well, you just become dependent on the system. And therefore you are compliant with what's going on. There's so much, again, the narratives keep weaving. Nicola, we're almost halfway through the show. I think we better get onto those headlines because we've got more to discuss on the other side, plus some interesting comments from comments out there. There's something that Stephen King set up before I go to the news. He wrote yesterday, the old writer himself, the idea seems to be if you don't like the judge's decisions, get rid of them. This is like firing the umpires if you don't like their calls. And I replied, it's awfully convenient when the authorities are corrupt and play lawfare, almost like the plot of a novella you wrote. Do you remember The Shawshank Redemption? And I thought that whole story was about a bad judge decision, like an innocent person being convicted. But King, of course, being a typical lefty, holds two positions on every issue. And therein lies the rub. That
I think it's very appropriate that Stephen King, the horror writer who used to very much enjoy selling, promoting, producing films where children were harmed, has officially gone to the dark side. I mean, the things Stephen King has been saying through the Biden administration and the Obama administration are extraordinary. And he seems to have been become part of some lunacy cult. Like, it's just crazy. You could go back, you could write a book on the tweets that Stephen King has put out over the last 5 to 10 years, and you just wouldn't believe it. You'd think it was satire, and it's not. He's completely serious. He's a complete weirdo. Sometimes he accompanies them with a picture of him in his house in a room. And yeah, it's a weird house because it's Stephen King, and he's a very strange cookie, right? He's strange cargo, that guy. And he's gone to the dark side. So he always wanted to be, and he always was on the dark side. And now it's official, Jason.
Absolutely. Well, getting into the headlines for today, and the breaking news is that Anthony Fauci's wife, Christine Grady, has been fired from the National Institute of Health position of head of bioethics. Now, here's another story you probably haven't heard of. George Soros's offices have been raided in India. Did you hear about it? The Enforcement Directorate conducted searches at the offices of the Open Societies Foundation, which is backed by US billionaire George Soros, along with several associated entities in Balangaroo, news agencies reported way back on March 18th. This action is part of an investigation into alleged violations of foreign exchange regulations, according to official sources. The searches have been carried out under the Foreign Exchange Management Act, or FEMA, and include the OSF along with various international human rights organisations. The investigation focuses on claims that the Open Source Foundation sourced foreign direct investment and that certain beneficiaries misused these funds in ways that contravene FEMA guidelines in that country. At this time, OSF has not responded to requests for comments regarding the Enforcement Directorate's actions. Soros, a Hungarian-American political activist, has faced accusations from the ruling BJP party in India of undermining India's interests. And isn't it interesting, therefore, that Marine Le Pen was taken out and sentenced to 4 years for the misuse of funds on a very minor scale? And here we have a similar story involving George Soros and mega amounts of funds. Roger Stone says there must be a JFK Files Part 2. He says releasing the JFK files is not as easy as a snap of the fingers, and the last month's disclosures were just the beginning. There are still many more important records that are being suppressed. As attorney Larry Schnapp has meticulously detailed, there are a host of vital documents and records not yet released that will paint the true picture of what happened on Dealey Plaza over 60 years ago. In his detailed article released on Substack, he details 6 areas known to be missing detailed information. And we'll discuss these areas later in the show, but they include the CIA Miami Station situation reports, a mob boss confession of Carlos Marcello, memos prepared by CIA Director John McCone, President and the CIA, their meeting transcript, NBC's Walter Sheridan's records, and Lee Harvey Oswald photograph. How about this? Taken by NBC on the ground at the time of the shooting. It's extraordinary. Also, a Mexican connection. So President Trump's tariffs will be revealed at 7 a.m. Sydney time. The Daily...
Are you okay there, buddy?
Excuse me. The Daily Australian records at 6 a.m. each morning, so we will bring you full coverage on Friday's show for that story. But Australian legacy media and the government expects a series of 20% tariffs on beef, pork and chicken exports. Newborns treated with antibiotics respond less well to vaccines. A study shows babies who are treated with antibiotics as newborns have reduced immune responses to vaccines in later infancy, likely due to changes in the gut microbiome, according to new research. The Australian study tracked 191 healthy babies from birth, finding that those who received antibiotics in the first few weeks of life had significantly lower levels of antibodies against multiple vaccines at 7 and 15 months. I'm still shaking my head at that story. Goodness me, like it's all about antibiotics. What about probiotics, people, and etc. Understanding what's really going on behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Dr. Andrew Wakefield has spoken at InfoWars or on InfoWars about how, as a gastroenterologist, parents kept coming to him complaining about how their children changed immediately after having MMR jabs, and what this led to a massive revelation that is almost too taboo to discuss in all of medical history. So you know what we're talking about there, and we're still speaking in cryptical code about this particular subject. Lowering bad cholesterol may cut the risk of dementia by 26%, a study suggests. Research highlights links between low LDL cholesterol and reduced dementia risk, with statins offering additional protection. This article is, this story is interesting because many studies are saying that statins appear to increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And now this study is, of course, saying the opposite. So we're wondering now what is going on in terms of science, how you can have two completely different positions on the same issue of one drug. Victoria has passed new laws that will raise the punishment from 6 months to 5 years for vilification of people based on how they identify themselves. So this is about being offended and sending someone to prison because they offended you. Now, a fake news alert has been issued that President's Secretary Caroline Leavitt says the news about Elon Musk stepping back from DOGE is garbage. The legacy media, including Murdoch, is in its second position on the middle column as usual, is running a hit piece claiming that Elon Musk will step down from his role in the Trump administration. This is nothing more than an attempt to create a false narrative of a rift between Musk and Trump. Billboard Chris Elston is in Australian court, and expert witnesses are arguing that X is not a sound platform for public debate, given its limited space to argue, which has been rebuffed due to the verified users having unlimited space to post. The expert witness is trying to say that they should be arguing on a different platform, for goodness sake. The FBI received a record number of new agent applications in Director Kash Patel's first full month leading the Bureau, with the flood of law enforcement job seekers nearly doubling the monthly average since 2016. There were 5,577 new applications submitted in March, Fox News has learned. The last time the Bureau saw a monthly figure even close to that number was in April of 2016, with 5,283 applications. Mark Zuckerberg is being seen walking into the West Wing at the White House, and Virginia Giuffre appeared in court for allegedly breaching a family violence restraining order just days before claiming she had days to live following a bus crash. The alleged breach happened in early February, and Ms. Giuffre's first appearance at the Magistrates Court in Joondalup in WA was on March the 14th. There was no plea entered at the hearing, with the next listed hearing on April the 9th. And Ms. Giuffre's estranged husband, Robert, is also facing separate charges. WA court lists show the police charged Mr. Giuffre for inadequate storage facility of firearms in February this year, and reckless driving exceeding the speed limit by 45 kilometres an hour or more on a length of road in September of last year. For the reckless driving charge, Robert was fined $1,200 and lost his licence for 6 months. Nicola.
Yeah, it's pretty awful, that law that was passed apparently at 4 o'clock in the morning in Victoria, saying that you may not offend anyone with your speech based on this and that.
It's interesting because it sort of covers all of the things that we find offensive about what government have done and said, but they won't be held to account, just us. And it's absolutely ridiculous. And also, I do worry that, because it's speech and it's what Americans call hearsay. And in America, you can't be found guilty of something based on hearsay. But that's exactly what we are going to be found guilty of. So someone's going to say, oh, I overheard her say this or him say that, and it's like, oh my God, here come the handcuffs.
Yes.
Don't have an opinion. And that's hearsay. So hearsay is going to be deemed criminal in Australia and Victoria.
It's extraordinary. So what the development there is, it will be illegal to offend, insult, humiliate, or ridicule a protected class of people based on their race, religion, nationality, their colour, national or ethnic origin, their age, sex or gender, their sexual orientation, their sexual characteristics, their gender identity, their disability, their HIV, AIDS or hepatitis status, their employment status, accommodation status, relationship status, sex work employee, medical or criminal record. But interestingly, there's also a provision called the Sam Kerr provision, if you will. So in other words, Sam Kerr is allowed to call a white police officer a fucking imbecile, which is what she said, but you're not if your skin colour is not the same as Sam's. How's that for a story?
Oh my God, this is ridiculous, isn't it? Basically, we're all going to be vying and gunning to become a protected class, right? We're all going to have to say we're something we're not to be a protected class so that we can be protected by the law. It's absolutely disgusting. Again, this is the breakdown of civil society. Now, I just want to mention as well, Albo and Dutton were in Melbourne yesterday, and Albanese stood there with a straight face, although I wouldn't call it too straight because he's very sleazy. He's got a very wriggly mouth. He knows he's not telling the truth. I can see it. It's written all over his face. He was saying that under Labour, there've been more new small businesses in this country. Let me just tell you, let me just give you the cold, hard truth about that. I'll tell you why he says there's more new businesses registered under Labour. When you buy a car in a dealership and all the new Australians are buying cars, there are 3 levels of pricing. There's the retail pricing, which is the price for you and me, the schleps who just go in and fall in love with a car. That's the most expensive. Then there's a heavily discounted pricing for people who have an ABN number, an Australian business number. And then there's a further discounted pricing if you've got fleet, and that's because you've got potential to buy multiple vehicles from the dealership. So what happens is people sit down at the desk to buy a vehicle, and let's say, for instance, they're told it's $50,000, but they're also told it's $47,000 if they've got an Australian business number, an ABN. Now, if they don't have one, the dealership will assist them in going online to a government website, registering for an ABN, an Australian business number that in a few months' time they can get rid of. They will get the discount on that vehicle, and they don't have a business. They don't intend on running a business. They've done it to get a discounted car. Now, all of those ABN registrations to get a discounted vehicle, whether it be a car, a van, a ute, anything, register under Labour's great new businesses since they've been in power. That's not what they are. They're not providing employment for anyone. You absolute buffoon. And he knows that, and he's knowingly lying to the Australian public.
Oh, look, that is such a brilliant example, and I know that there are many rorts in the car industry, mainly because of tax concessions, etc. There were some horrific stories back in the 80s and 90s of particular people who had tax exemptions, having cozy relationships with car dealers, so they would sell them a car and then they would trade it straight back, and that would circumvent the tax rules or whatever it was, and then they'd be then sold as demonstrators or near new at $20,000 below retail. And there's some horror stories about how that works, but it just shows you that if you're overtaxed, then you're going to create a situation like this. And this goes back to back in the 80s when Paul Keating introduced the luxury car tax, which is 33% on top of at a certain level. So I think it started way back then, probably in the high 40,000 mark for a car. It's now, I think, in the mid 70s, something like that. So if you buy a car that's got a list price of over $75,000, for every dollar over that amount, you have to pay a 33% tax. So a $100,000 motor vehicle, which these days is not really that expensive for a decent quality car.
No, that's the one I want. It's 100. Yeah.
I mean, I
Can't
walked
have it,
into
but I want it.
I walked into a Kia car yard the other day, and there wasn't a car under $65,000 for a Kia.
But I reckon the sale of cars is actually a really big part of the Australian economy. I really do. Because Australia is a bit like California. I lived in California. It's big. You have to travel vast differences to get from town to city. For instance, if you want to drive from Melbourne to Sydney, for instance, I think it's between 8 and 9 hours, right? Depending on what you're driving. And I think knowing what the car industry generates, I think it's a really important part of the economy, right, in Australia. And that's why, as I've said, they've brought in all these new Australians and we've got all these laws so you don't vilify them, so they feel welcome and don't leave. Because one of the first things they do is buy a home and then go and get a new car. They really do like their cars, the new Australians. And so, you know, it's all to protect the money. This isn't because they're worried about someone's feelings. You know, they haven't cared for years about the way Australians talk to each other. In fact, culturally, this could be challenged in court, and I'll tell you why. And it's going to be hard to describe without going a bit blue on air, to be honest. But I'm sure you know, Jason. The way Australian men, and I'm talking European Australian, Greek Australian, Italian Australian, Lebanese Australian, all different kinds of Australian men, right? The way they greet each other in a friendly manner is with insults. You know, so I remember when I first got here, I was quite shocked. And a guy who's a friend of mine who's a business owner, I went to see him to say hi. And a person walked in to his office, the reception of his business behind me. And he shouted out, my friend, oh, my God, look at this ugly cunt, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, my God, it's an enemy and these two men are going to have a fight. Mm. And the guy behind me said, not as ugly as you, cunt. And then they grabbed each other and had a big hug. Because the way Australian men, you know, working men greet each other is with a massive slew of insults. And that means they're really good friends. It was very hard for me to get on board with that. And when Australians say mate or may like that, they're actually angry with you. They're calling you mate, but they're actually angry with you. They're not happy with you, let's say. Right. So, you know, okay, let's consider all these other cultures that are coming in, but we have a culture here and it's actually a tricky one to understand. So what's going to happen is it's going to feel like we're vilifying people and we're suddenly criminals for behaving in what is our cultural norms, if you know what I mean. So because it's not finessed, this stuff, you know, and it's quite worrying that it also includes you can't vilify someone based on whether they have HIV or AIDS. I mean, that's a very odd one to throw in there, considering what we've been through with the injection rollout, that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were saying it's your duty as a Briton to get an HIV test right after they got vaccinated, right? It's really odd. So how are we going to, do we have to culturally adjust? It's this thing again that we have to throw our culture down the toilet. And I'm not saying it's, you know, it's a much loved part of culture that Australian men call each other a cunt before they hug, but it is part of the culture. So if they can have their culture protected, why can't ours be protected? I think that's what I'm trying to say, Jason.
Yeah, it's obvious, isn't it? But therefore, what we're seeing now with the Sam Kerr law is that we now have a two-speed system, and this is all to attack essentially what is the Anglo-Saxon, the white person, the traditional imported first immigrant Australian, if you will, if you want to go down that path.
Who built the country? They import them to build the new world, which was Australia, and they did do that for them.
Now, Ralph Babet, the senator from Victoria, posted on the 31st of March. He said, remember when friends could talk trash to each other without anyone getting offended? We'd call each
Same
other.
thing. That's
We
what he's talking about. Yeah.
Exactly. He said we call each other. He said, I'm not going to say the W word, the S word, and worse. He says, yet we're all mates back in school. Not a day went by without roasting your friends. The
That's right.
closer the mate, the harder the banter. How did
Yes.
we become so soft over the last 20 years? And I wrote a reply, and I wrote this. I said, they hate God, and now they hate science or evolution. Survival of the fittest by literally protecting the weakest at any and all costs, including eroding all freedoms, whether used or not to do so. It doesn't matter. Literally, it is survival of the weakest at the expense of the rest. This is Satan pretending to care, to rope in rescuers to do his work. When the time comes, the weakest will be eliminated through compliance. Tell you what, that is what I wrote, and this is what I actually think is the case.
It's a sit down and shut up again in basic terms, right? And this is part of our indoctrination, right? Because if we're afraid to speak to the place it's going to have its biggest rollout is going to be in the workplace, right? So if we're timid and afraid to say boo to a goose, as we say in the UK, at work, then that indoctrinates you to feel potentially the same way about government. We know they don't want us criticizing government. So we are actually becoming very much like a Chinese society. Now, what's interesting about that, and although I am pleased that China are pushing back against BlackRock, what's interesting about that is that all of these countries that we seem to be mirroring, people can't get out of there quick enough, right? My Chinese friends that I have, that they wanted to come to Australia because it was more free, because they felt afraid and they wanted to come to a country where they didn't feel afraid. And now here we are, and they're speaking publicly. They're saying these are the warning signs, right? You're heading towards socialism and communism. You know, even survivors of, the Second World War and the Nazis, they're coming out and saying it's happening, it's happening. We saw this in Europe, and now it's starting to happen in the Western world. These are the first stages. So I don't want to go to work. I mean, I've got two guys that I work with at work, and they do that cultural Australian thing. And one is from one culture and the other's from another culture. And they say truly shocking things to each other at work as banter, just walking around work, because they actually really like each other and their mates. And some of it's so shocking. Like, I nearly spit out my coffee yesterday while I was sitting at my desk because it's quite raw going to work in Australia. Now, if you're telling me the new Australians are going to rock up in our businesses and look at us sideways and be offended because we're not behaving, how's that even going to work? And also, Albo said in part of his speech, I'm all about social cohesion. No, you're not, because you're not attempting assimilation. You should be saying to these people, yeah, don't worry about this banter. This is part of Australian culture. But they're not saying that. They're saying, oh, report them to the police. That's essentially what they're saying. And by the way, this is completely off topic, but I want to say it before I forget it, and I need to get it into the show. There is a clip going around on YouTube, and it's Keir Starmer out of the UK, and he's talking in an interview, and with regard to the winter fuel allowance, which he removed from old people, and they've just shivered their way through winter in the UK, and some of them would have lost their lives because it gets very cold there. He kept calling it the winter fool allowance.
Interesting,
like
isn't it?
literally giving you the finger, Jason.
Yeah, yeah. And again, who are these people working for? And this is when there is a crime against the people, that your leaders are all traitors because they don't work for you and they're working for another agenda. Now, the idea that society has come to a stage where dropping a C word is a term of endearment, but you can't recognise the person's where their origins, where they came from. This is the whole point of assimilation. Now, let's just explore this for a moment. If you came from a Mediterranean country, you were recognised by a certain term, and that was a recognition of the colour of your skin, how you combed your hair, what you put in your hair, the food.
And everyone learnt that Greek swear word that begins with M that neither of us should say. Do you know what I mean? And everyone says it as a joke.
But the point was, it was a recognition. Now, what it said was, I acknowledge that you come from Greece or Italy. Now, the same could be said that you said it about an Irish Catholic immigrant, or a Jewish European immigrant.
But the Greeks and Italians were called wogs, and they're still called wogs. In fact, there's a stage show called Wog Boys.
Yeah.
My husband was bullied at school and called a wog, and then it became a term of endearment. That's how you get past this kind of thing, right? Cultural differences, and now they're proud of it, and they say, you know, where do you come from? And they say, I'm a wog, and they're really, really proud of it, you know. And already when I got here, I was shocked by that, because that word was considered an insult in the UK as well. And that's another cultural thing in Australia, right? So what, it was okay for the Italians and Greeks to go through that, but the new Australians are too fragile. They can't go through their version of it.
Well, the fact that you can interchange the word wog and say it's bad, but you can drop a C word in a public place and you just have to accept it.
Not for long. I would hazard a guess, not for long.
But the thing is that's accepted. Like that's okay. That's how stupid the laws are. And the fact that the retaliation from the immigrant was to call an Australian a skippy was like, well, yeah, okay, I'm Aussie, and therefore what that was a form of a term of endearment. But what it was saying was that what it's saying is the immigrant is saying, I'm bringing something to your country, mate, that you don't have. So therefore, I'm acknowledging you that you're pretty two-dimensional in what you're doing.
Well, my husband used to say to them at school, shut your face. You know, your parents came in chains, mine paid for their ticket.
So therefore, well, then the Australian could say, well, therefore, I can show you that I've improved the country because it's worth a lot more now.
But we all got it right, Jason, because I'm a POM, right? So there were skippies and skips, and there still is, when they say, oh, you know, where's that guy from? And they say he's a skip, that means he's Australian. These are the things that the new Australian need to learn. And when they say POM, that means you're British. That's me. So I'm a POM, and the Greeks and Italians were wogs, and the Aussies were skips. But you know what? They tell everyone they're anti-Semitic. There was no name or label given to Jewish people in Australia. That's why I've said many times I don't think Australians are anti-Semitic. They might be importing people that are, but you know, that's out of our control. That's government. But Jason, have we lived through this and experienced this and navigated this and successfully made these terms of endearments, but now we're going to never have to say them again? Or are there only certain protected classes and it's not those groups? I don't feel as a British person, as a POM, that I would ever be a protected class, and nor would I want to be. So it's one rule for one or a couple of groups of people and another rule for the rest of us, surely.
I'll pull that apart a little bit. Look, anti-Semitism has been around forever. I've seen it. I've seen it. My family members have experienced it. It happened to my father in school days. Some horrific stories that he had, and he was probably the biggest, strongest man that I ever met. And he fought in different ways. And these kids would get into all sorts of trouble at school. I remember my dad telling me that someone called him a Jew bastard at school, and he threw him off the bear pit at Sydney Boys High and was suspended for a week. And he said, I won't cop it. And so it was a big story back then.
But these are children. You're talking about children.
Well, this is high school age. This is sort of 13, 14, 15, 16. He wouldn't tolerate it. So this
they're idiots at that age. We know that
in Australia. So look, there are stories of anti-Semitism.
Okay, you're saying this, Jason, but the Jewish community is now a protected class because we've got very strong anti-Semitism laws. So we've also got Islamophobic laws, you know, anti-Islamophobia, whatever you want to call it, which is crazy because we've had Muslims in Australia for years and years, you know, Lebanese and all sorts of different cultures. So you don't need to worry because, you know, the Jewish community now is a protected class. The gay community is a protected class. The trans community is a protected class. New migrants are a protected class. But you know what's not a protected class? The OG Australians, the originals. So you don't need to worry about the protected classes because the rest of us are going to jail if we say anything shit towards them. But the thing is, what this means is these new migrants and these protected classes, they can be offensive. They can break the law. They can make threats. And what the original Australians can't defend themselves. It means you can't criticize them. This is like when Barack Obama was president in America. Because he was the first black president, he could do no wrong, except he consistently did wrong. He consistently bombed countries. And now we know he moved biological weapons to China when he said he was stopping gain-of-function research. So what you're doing is you're setting up the same scenario as Barack Obama. right? People can do wrong because they're a protected class. I'm not saying they're going to, but I'm saying you have to have one rule across the board, and everything has to be taken on a case by case basis. That was terrible what happened to your dad, but it was no different than what happened to my Greek husband as a child, right? Because kids when they're 13, 14, 15, 16 are little assholes, right? And they should face punishment for that, but on an individual basis, because that's bullying. Aside from anything else about a protected class, it's bullying. It's horrible. Get them out the school, suspend them, and what's it called? Expel them. But what I'm saying is, you must admit, Jason, it has to be the same across the board. I mean, you're basically saying there's no Australian that's ever going to be offended by anything. Of course there is.
No, what I'm saying is that anti-Semitism exists and always has existed, and Jewish people have been slandered as much as anyone else in horrific ways. And when you grow up as a kid and you experience something like that, the first time you don't even know that you're different. That's the point. Kids don't know they're different until someone tells them that they are. But at the same time, 100% correct. You can only have one rule. So this is the politics of division in real time, and that's what I was saying before in my statement. That what they're doing is that they are this survival of the weakest, which is anti-evolution. So therefore, our politicians who tell you that Christianity is bad, that any religion is bad, but Islamic immigration, well, we're just going to come in, and if you don't accept it, you're an Islamophobe. But so we're not allowed to question anything there. By the way, in the Quran, it actually says that the state of Israel exists and belongs to the Jewish people. It's in the Quran. So let's put that out there for a little bit of a conversation and a bit of an icebreaker for what's going on. But you can't live in a society that is anti-God, anti-Christian, pro-Islam because you can't criticize it, and then say that you're pro-science, but then you're not acknowledging what evolution is.
Well, you can, Jason, because that's what your Australian politicians are trying to engineer.
What do you mean my Australian politicians? Everyone's Australian politicians, not my bloody Australian politicians.
They are creating,
that's exactly what they're doing.
Dystopia.
Exactly
Hell
right.
on earth.
Well, there you go. So where I'm going with all of this is I'm always looking for a solution, and that's why I've argued, and that's why I created that whole new show called The 51st State, because that's the point. It is the globalists versus the nationalists. Australia is, as this particular person, this billionaire person that you talked about earlier has identified, Australia is a lost cause. It's impossible. Again, this is the point. Anthony Albanese is the weakest politician I've ever seen in my lifetime. If you lined up all the former politicians and prime ministers in Australia, you'd look at him and you go, this is devolution. This is the opposite of evolution. I would expect by now in Australia that what's his name, Jack Reacher is what our Australian Prime Minister would look like. A 6'6", body-built, strong, muscular RFK physique would be the Prime Minister. Instead, we've got this wobbly jellyfish who can't talk properly, who can't take a position on anything, who's clearly a servant to multiple masters, as I keep talking about.
And the script reading, he's constantly reading off a script that someone else wrote for him. I like leaders who can stand there and have a conversation because their morality and their principles, their ducks are in a row, and he doesn't have that. We don't know who Anthony Albanese is because he's never spoken unscripted to the people of this country.
And that's just the limit. But then you look at the rest of the Labor Party. There's no one in there that you'd want to fight for your life.
Where's Crocodile Dundee? We need a Crocodile Dundee, right, to be the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister of Australia can look Australian and still say, come one, come all, we're doing migration or whatever. But, if you're a criminal, that's it. You're going to be expelled from the country. And that's what they are doing. My friend that was assaulted by an Afghan migrant, the judge said to him, sexually assaulted, the judge said to him, you can either do life in prison in Australia, which costs us a lot of money, or you can go back to Afghanistan. And he went back to Afghanistan. So they are doing that, but we're not hearing about this. They don't want us to hear about this. But why can't we have a good, decent, strong Australian politician? Where are you all? Why is it all the sleazy mother effers who want to get into politics and you don't want to help anybody and you don't care about this country and you're just lining your own pockets? It's bloody disgusting. This is a call to action by the real guys, the good guys, the real Australians. And we need you to be youngish. We need you to be in your 40s because we might need you for a long time. Wherever you are, give yourself a shake, wake up and start doing something. And if you're not doing something in politics, at least speak out publicly the way we are.
When you think about it, then you talked about a Crocodile Dundee type of politician. Well, that politician in Australia would the closest that you would get to it would be the one that's also the longest serving in our parliament. And that's Bob Katter. I mean, he even looks like Crocodile Dundee with the big cowboy hat.
Does he?
and the other one you've got, of course, is Russell Broadbent, the second
Yes.
and longest term. Now, that gives you an example of the generational gap that's going on. So these guys have been in office for almost 30 years each, give or take, and have seen and done everything. They started, I don't know if Bob Katter started in Old Parliament House, but New Parliament House was created in 1988, and I think Russell was first elected in 1990. So it gives you an idea that he's been there for that long. Now, if you then look at the Liberal Party, but you look at the same thing there. So the Liberals struggled. And John Howard came back and finally got in, and they called it the second rising of Lazarus or something was the quote
Oh my
at the time
God. That's a bit
he
much.
came. But the point was that he was all but dead. He ran twice in opposition and was gone, and he was replaced by Alexander Downer, and who was pathetic, and actually he got dumped for a horrific slur that he actually came out and thought it was a joke and it was a slur regarding domestic violence.
But it doesn't matter with politicians. Pauline Hanson has slurred and been taken to court for it, and she's still in the Senate. This is the thing. They get this parliamentary privilege, so they do have their freedom of speech, and we don't.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that it cost Downer his political leadership career, and then there was talk of Peter Costello, and of course there was Andrew Peacock, and they went through a bunch of different opposition leaders, and no one won. So Howard fought his way back, won an election basically against a Labor government that had been in power for 13 years and had reached their own use-by date, and Howard came in and did a Conservative run and was very, very successful. But then you look at the leaders that have come since Howard. So we had Kevin Rudd, who looked like at the time he made John Howard age 20 years overnight because he looked similar, had similar sort of facial features, etc., but was 25 years younger. And so he looked young and fit, and that's why there was a Rudd revolution, Kevin 07. He lasted 3 years, even though the Liberals went through a series of opposition leaders. They had Brendan Nelson, and they had, and then eventually they arrived at Tony Abbott, who was probably Australia's best opposition leader, certainly I've ever seen. He destroyed Kevin Rudd in 3 years, and then didn't win. But Gillard created a minority government using 3 independents. Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, I think, were the 2 that I can remember. And there was Andrew Wilkie from Tasmania that created the 2013 minority government of Gillard. Abbott eventually wins in 16, and Abbott was probably held to be the strongest in terms of physique and ability, but he lasts only a term. And then eventually Turnbull replaces him, who would have to be the second weakest politician I've ever
That's
seen.
the thing. Everyone that gets elected in Australia disappoints, right?
Yeah.
And there's this phrase that I use a lot with politics: disappointed but not surprised. If I had to call everything that's happening in Australia right now, I would call it disappointed but not surprised. But I don't want to be disappointed. Jason, we are really backs against the wall towards the end of the show. Mum, I got to go to work. What would you like to say before we go?
Well, on the balance of probabilities and what's going on today is a very interesting day. There are many people, including myself, that certainly yesterday I felt a little bit like we were being overrun or run over by a series of horrific news pieces that were looking like there is more of a white anting of everything that we know and love in this country going into an election. Be that as it may, it provides the impetus for all of us in an election cycle to start asking big questions. I forgot to mention, I was surveyed yesterday for the second time in this election campaign about the election. And I was asked a series of questions about who I would support more, Labor or Liberal. And I kept answering every question I took on its merits. But for the majority, 95% of them, I answered neither. Who do you think is going to be better at this? I said neither. How about this? Neither. And at the end of the survey, the lady on the other end of the phone, she was actually giggling, and she said to me, "This is going to be recorded." And I said because I said the reason I'm saying these things is because they're both globalists. It's the same. There's no difference. And I said to her, then she said, "Who'd be better at it?" And I said neither. And she actually said something that I'm sure she's not allowed to say. She said, most people are answering neither.
No, it's true. I know who that is. I actually know the company that does that, and they are nice people that work there. They actually choose their workers really carefully. I know the guy that hires them. Actually, I won't mention the name, but they're good people. So it's funny that they're listening to that, right? These are the people that do the research for all kinds of things, but particularly politics. That's interesting. Well, I my phone did go with a weird number yesterday. Maybe they wouldn't have wanted to get me, Jason. They wouldn't have wanted to get me on the phone. That wouldn't have ended well. So another big show. Thank you so much for listening to us on the Daily Australian. We get a bit fired up on this show, and we don't really have enough time to discuss what we want to discuss. And when we get sort of more investment, we'll make the show longer and we'll get into it more if you want us to run for longer. Our website is underway, so hopefully that should be with us very soon, or at least soon-ish. These things take a time to build, but we really do appreciate you listening to us and allowing us to have our opinion in what is a very, very rapidly changing political landscape in Australia. And as I said, quite disappointing, but not surprised. Thanks for listening to myself, Nicola Charles, and my co-host and co-producer, Jason Olborn. What day are we on, Jason? Thursday?
Thursday.
Happy Thursday. We'll do this all over again tomorrow.